What happens when a rancher gave his only blanket to two Apache sisters at dawn? 300 warriors arrived. Witness this unbelievable true-inspired story right here on Whisper of the Past. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from. Let's get started. The year was 1873, and the Arizona Territory was a land of extremes. Scorching days gave way to bone-chilling nights, and trust between settlers and Apache tribes was as scarce as water in the desert. This is the story of how one simple act of humanity changed everything for a lonely rancher named Thomas Crawford and became a legend whispered across the Southwest for generations. Thomas Crawford was not a wealthy man. He had come west after the Civil War, seeking solitude and a fresh start from memories that haunted him. His ranch was modest, barely more than a wooden cabin with a small corral and a few dozen cattle scattered across the harsh landscape. He kept to himself, trading occasionally with the nearby settlement of Prescott, but mostly living in the kind of silence that only the desert can provide. November had arrived early that year, bringing with it winds that cut through clothing like knives. Thomas had just one wool blanket to his name, a threadbare thing that had seen better days but still provided warmth during the freezing desert nights. It was all that stood between him and the cold that settled into the valley after sunset. On that fateful evening, as the sun began its descent behind the jagged mountains, Thomas was checking his fences when he heard something unusual. A soft whimpering sound carried on the wind. He froze, listening carefully. Years of living alone had sharpened his senses, and he knew this was not the cry of an animal. Lowering the sound, he discovered two young Apache girls huddled behind a cluster of rocks near the dry creek bed. They couldn't have been more than 8 and 10 years old. Their deerskin dresses were torn, their feet bloodied, and their lips cracked from dehydration. They looked at him with eyes that held both fear and desperate hope. Thomas raised his hand slowly, showing he meant no harm. He had picked up enough Apache words over the years to understand they were lost, separated from their family during a raid by rival tribes. The older sister, who he would later learn was named Nell, held her younger sibling protectively, even as she trembled from cold and exhaustion. Without hesitation, Thomas made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He gestured for them to follow him to his cabin. The girls were hesitant, but the promise of shelter and the genuine kindness in his weathered face convinced them to trust this stranger. Inside his modest home, Thomas built up the fire and offered them what little food he had: dried beans, some jerky, and fresh water from his well. The girls ate slowly at first, then ravenously, as if they hadn't eaten in days. They probably hadn't. As night fell and the temperature plummeted, Thomas faced a choice. He had only one blanket. The girls were shivering despite the fire, their thin clothing offering little protection against the desert's brutal night cold. He looked at his blanket, then at the two frightened children, and the decision was obvious. Thomas wrapped his only blanket around both girls, tucking it carefully around their small frames. Nasha looked up at him with tears in her eyes, understanding the sacrifice he was making. The younger sister was already falling asleep, finally feeling safe and warm. That night, Thomas Crawford sat by the fire, feeding it constantly to keep the cabin warm. He wore every piece of clothing he owned, but still shivered through the long, dark hours. He dozed occasionally in his chair, never complaining, never regretting his choice. In his mind, there had been no choice at all. These were children, and they needed help. As dawn approached, Thomas must have finally fallen into a deeper sleep, exhausted from staying awake most of the night. The first rays of sun were just touching the horizon when he was awakened by a sound that made his blood run cold: the thunder of hundreds of hooves. Thomas stumbled to his window and his heart nearly stopped. Surrounding his small ranch, stretching as far as he could see in the dim morning light, were Apache warriors. He counted quickly, his military training from years ago kicking in. There had to be 300 of them, maybe more. They sat motionless on their horses, forming a perfect circle around his property. This was it, Thomas thought. This was how his story would end. He had helped two Apache children, but their tribe didn't know that. They would see only a white rancher who had taken two of their own. He thought of running, of grabbing his rifle, but he knew both options were futile. Instead, he simply opened his door and stepped outside, ready to face whatever came next with dignity. The warriors remained still as statues, their faces painted for war, weapons ready. Then, from the ranks, 3 riders moved forward. Thomas recognized one of them immediately as a chief by his bearing and the way others deferred to him. His weathered face was stern, his eyes sharp as an eagle's. Before Thomas could speak, the door of his cabin opened behind him. The 2 girls ran out, crying out in Apache. They rushed past Thomas and into the arms of the 3 riders. One of them, Thomas now realized, was their father. The other was their uncle, and the stern-faced chief was their grandfather. What happened next, Thomas would remember for the rest of his days. The grandfather, Chief Chato, dismounted and walked slowly toward Thomas. The rancher stood his ground, unsure if he should speak or remain silent. When the chief was close enough to touch him, he stopped and studied Thomas's face for a long moment. Then the older sister stepped forward and spoke rapidly in Apache. pointing at Thomas, then at the blanket still clutched in her little sister's hands, then at Thomas again. She was telling them everything, about how he had found them, fed them, given them his only blanket, and sat awake all night by the fire to keep them warm. Chief Chatto's stern expression slowly changed. He reached out and placed his hand on Thomas's shoulder. Through the uncle, who spoke some English, the chief said words that Thomas would never forget. "You gave everything you had to save our children when you had no reason to help them. You treated them as your own. Such a man deserves to live without fear." What followed was unprecedented in those violent times. The 300 warriors weren't there to attack. They had come to bring gifts. Over the next hour, as the sun rose fully over the Arizona desert, the warriors approached one by one. They brought blankets, fine wool and deerskin ones that would last for years. They brought food, enough to fill Thomas's small cabin. They brought a horse, a strong mare that would serve him well. They even brought silver jewelry, Apache craftsmanship that was priceless. But more than the gifts, they brought something else. Chief Chatto declared before all assembled that Thomas Crawford was now under the protection of the Apache people. Any harm that came to him would be considered harm to the tribe itself. In a land where settlers and native peoples lived in constant conflict, Thomas had been granted something almost unheard of: complete safety and the friendship of one of the most formidable tribes in the Southwest. As the warriors prepared to leave, Nasha ran back to Thomas one more time. She pressed something into his hand, a small woven bracelet she had made from threads of his blanket. "Through her uncle," she said, "so you remember that kindness is never wasted." Thomas Crawford lived on that ranch for another 30 years. True to their word, the Apache people never forgot what he had done. In times of drought, they shared water sources with him. When cattle rustlers threatened the area, Apache scouts would warn him. And every year, on the anniversary of that cold November night, Nasha would visit with her family, bringing small gifts and sharing a meal with the rancher who had once given everything he had to save to lost children. The story of Thomas Crawford and the two Apache sisters spread throughout the territory, a reminder that even in the darkest times, one act of genuine kindness can bridge divides that seem impossible to cross. It proved that humanity transcends borders, cultures, and conflicts. Thomas kept that small woven bracelet until the day he died, and in his will he requested it be returned to Nasha's family. Today, it remains a treasured artifact, a symbol of the night when a rancher gave his only blanket to two Apache sisters. And at dawn, 300 warriors arrived, not for war, but to honor a good man. This story reminds us that compassion requires no common language, that protecting the vulnerable is a universal value, and that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can create the most profound legacies. In a world that often seems divided, perhaps we all need to remember the lesson of Thomas Crawford, that when we give everything we have to help another human being, we receive back more than we could ever imagine. Thank you for watching Whisper of the Past. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave a comment below telling us what act of kindness has changed your life. Until next time, remember that history's greatest moments often come from the simplest acts of human decency.